You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Tuesday evening, folks. Yeah, it's second day of the week already. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to find out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. Come on over, check them out, check the schedule, find all the places where this show can be heard. You can also find archives of this show on iTunes and on Spreaker, and there's several different locations. Of course, as well as all the video simulcasts that are archived over on my YouTube channel, where you can also go right now if you want to. Join the live chat room, watch the video simulcast of this program at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Tonight I want to talk about something that it plagues me a bit, vexes me, gives me the pox. A plague on both your houses, you want to declare, like Shakespeare said. When you see all the fighting and the arguing that's going on right now. Now, so far, I'm of course talking about the rioting and all the racial tension that's going on right now, and political tension, all of this stuff. Let's take that and not talk about those things as specifics, but move them aside a bit and talk about the nature of how we act and why we do what we do. Sometimes our arguing, our caterwauling, our fighting, many times, most of the time, is based in something that's much deeper within us. You could talk to somebody who is a person of color and find out that their struggles are the things that have led them to believe what they believe. Sometimes those struggles might not be exactly what they see, but it's how they have interpreted things and experienced them, and they act out of that. We all act out of things that are in our past, the things that cause us to do what we do. My own case, many of you know, and maybe those of you who are newer to this program haven't heard me talk about this, but in my own sexual abuses as a kid, those ingrained in me a need to seek for justice, a need to seek for right, a need to fight things that are wrong. Sometimes, as I found in counseling many years ago, 30 plus years ago, that I would get myself into relationships and into situations that I knew innately, subconsciously were wrong for me, that I shouldn't be there, but I got into them so I could allow myself to feel that abuse and work to correct it from an adult point of view. Now, none of that sounds adult. That sounds like something that's childhood, things that we're trapped into. I've got to get myself into something wrong so I can subconsciously right that wrong. And those are the things we get stuck in. Now, I'm not saying that everybody that's protesting out there right now is somebody who's stuck in their childhood. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. So again, take the more tangible issue of protest and rioting and set that aside. That's not exactly what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the need we all have to fight, the things that bolster the fight in us, the things that help us be strong about our points of view, and to fight for what we believe is right and good. We all have those things, but there are always things on a subconscious level that push us to do those things. Sometimes it's just wanting to do what is right and what we believe is right. But there's not a single one of us that believes we are wrong when we come to the table well, I'm not even going to use the term come to the table. When we are not at the table, but fighting about something, resisting something. None of us wants to admit that we might be wrong about something. So what do? We put up the fight and we justify our actions rather than finding ways to compromise. Now, compromise is not weakness. Compromise is the core of unity. On a national level, compromise is the core of unity. Now, sometimes you got to win the battle to impose compromise. Sometimes you've got to sometimes when compromise is not allowed or it's being resisted, you've got to fight and you've got to subdue what you know is wrong. And the outcome will all depend on who's stronger and what the outcome is going to be. And so I started thinking about this and started wanting to look at ways to compromise. And I put up a little piece on my Facebook earlier this morning, and it had to do with a conversation that I had late last night. Now, you guys all know me. If you know my Facebook, I throw up things sometimes to get conversations started. But in recent months, I've backed way off of trying to get too deep into social media conversation, social media arguing and fighting. I did it primarily because we've always done radio shows. I've always done a radio show. I do a political radio show with Rocky. Well, it's not political anymore, but we hit more on political topics than I do here. And I throw up posts to see how people react. And so we can bring some of that information into the radio show and talk about it. And I got to tell you, there are days... let me restart that sentence. I've backed away from getting too deep into political conversation. You know why? It's a waste of time. Arguing over opinion is a waste of time. It gets you nowhere. And you pretty soon have to realize that when you step back from that and look back at it, you can say, okay, you've said A, B, and C. I've said X, Y, and Z, and both from a point of opinion. End of debate. There's nothing more to debate because we both expressed an opinion. And opinions, you can't really debate them. You can't really change anybody's mind. That mind needs to be changed on their own, depending on whatever they've encountered and whatever they experience to change their point of view. And I'm not talking about, you notice I'm being deliberately blank on any topic. I'm not talking about topics. I'm talking about sustaining your point of view and seeking compromise instead. And last night, and I wrote about this morning, I had a wonderful conversation with a dear friend late last night. And this was after a day, and I didn't spend the whole day on Facebook or social media, but there was if you tally it up, a good hour's worth of if you put them all end to end, hours worth of typing and arguing and presenting, and it became muddy. It felt muddy. It felt dirty. I didn't like the way I felt when I came out of that. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because there were so many nasty viewpoints and so much nastiness and corrosiveness, and you try to counter that without being nasty or corrosive. And sometimes you just stop and say, hey, look, you're being kind of a jerk. And here's how and so on. And after a while, you just feel a little dirty about it. I'm not talking about feeling like you've done something wrong, just that you've dragged yourself through the mud to fight the mud, and you get out and you feel muddy. And there were people in some of those threads that are people that are very close to me, some of my own family members, that would rather chide me than support me as an individual. And that was hurtful to respect. But, like I've always said, you're only offended by the things that you allow to offend you. So I'm not offended when I step back from it, because I realize that offense is a choice. Being offended is a choice. I choose not to be offended by those things. Now, that's my personal side of what went on yesterday. And it was a bit bothersome. I even wanted to personally call or write some of the people that were saying things that are very close to me and say, what gives? What the hell? What the fuck? What the? You know me better than that. You're putting on a dog and pony show for your audience, for the people who follow you. I don't appreciate that. So those are the things, and you come out of that and you feel crappy. So I had a conversation with somebody, and this person actually contacted me and said, mentioned all this arguing about the statue issue and the fights, and this person is on the complete opposite end of the political spectrum from me. But this is also a person who we have always tried to find the ways that we can come together, that we can compromise, despite being on opposite ends of the spectrum. You don't have to give up your core beliefs or your core values to find a way to come together in a compromise. So I had this wonderful conversation last night. And as I mentioned, we're on opposite ends of the political spectrum, yet we found ways to reach out to each other, to talk with respect, and to honor each other's points of view without, for lack of a better word, capitulation or abdication of our core values. Still brought our values to the table, but said we can honor each other's points of view. How can we do that on a national level? There wasn't any screaming or ranting at each other in this conversation, but we had a sincere desire to see if there were ways that we could come together in our thinking, find a path to solving problems that swirl in the whirlwind around us. Not that anybody would necessarily listen to us. We're not in seats of power. We have no particular sway over the masses. But we wanted to find individually. And I think we didn't enter the conversation saying, let's find great ways that we can come together. But I think that was the subconscious level. I remember when I first saw her message me last night, I thought, oh boy, I'm going to have to get into a conversation where we disagree, and I don't want to do that with this person. And I almost avoided looking at the message because I saw who it was from, and I thought, don't want to do that. Yet I still opened it up, and we started talking, and we got pretty quickly into the topic of the day. And because she had seen the posts that were going on, and it was all around racial tensions and statues and stuff like that. And so we wanted to find a path, I think. There was a subconscious almost to finding this path to making things work better. And in the end, I got to be very honest with you and tell you, my heart was filled and warmed despite expressing our differences, because we, as two individuals, focused intently on expressing our views while reaching deep into the love and respect we had for each other. And so for us, there was a respect that was already there, even though we consciously disagree on politics and lots of issues, we subconsciously respect each other on that sub-level to things. And so we spoke about that statue issue. And I said that my perspective is a bit different on this. And this is she had actually presented her perspective on it, that it was something that offended black people and offended, and this was the tack that she took. And I said, I think that there's a different way to look at this statue issue, and this is how I presented it. And I said, remember, in the Civil War, the South fought to defend slavery. Now, we can try to write the whole slavery issue out of the Civil War, but when it really boils down to it, the economics of the South, of this or that, people say, well, Civil War was about economics, not slavery. Yeah, it was about slavery, because slavery was the hinge pin to economics. It's like we talked about last week about George Washington. When he gave up his slaves at the end of his life, when he freed his slaves, he couldn't do it during his lifetime and had resistance from his family because freeing his 153 slaves would have hurt them financially. Thomas Jefferson, the same thing. Although I think he was more of a racist than Washington was. As much as I respect Jefferson as a thinker, he had over 600 slaves. And he only freed 7 of them by the end of his life. And because, as he said, freeing his slaves would destroy him financially. Because the whole system that existed at that time was built on utilizing slaves. Now, he treated his slaves very well, Jefferson, but he never freed them. Now, that's another issue, and I don't want to rabbit trail on that. But, almost 90 years later, as we're in the Civil War, the South fought to defend the institution of slavery because abolishing slavery would, in their minds, at that time in history, have destroyed them economically. And that was their justification for it. Now that was the South's focus, to defend slavery. What was the North's focus? The Union. The North's focus was not to end slavery. Let that one sink in for a second. They weren't there to end slavery. That's not why they fought the war. The North's focus was on preserving the Union, the United States. And they accomplished that in the end, at the end of the war. They preserved the Union. And there's this illustration. It's not even an illustration. It's a historical anecdote. And I've mentioned this before, but I think it fits in here, and I mentioned it in my conversation with my friend last night. I said, the South fought the Civil War to defend slavery. The North fought the Civil War to defend and preserve the Union. Now, I remember what Ulysses S. Grant said to his soldiers who were jeering Robert E. Lee and his troops as they marched up the Lynchburg Road from Appomattox. Now, if you've never been to Appomattox Courthouse, little town, it's not really a town anymore. It's got a bunch of buildings that are preserved there. The house where Ulysses S. Grant met with Robert E. Lee and they signed the surrender of the South and ended the Civil War. That house is still there. The room is still there. The furniture is still there, preserved. It's all a museum. A little tiny town of like a dozen buildings. And there's the old dirt road there, which now the major freeway cuts around this. They built the freeway around Appomattox. A small, I don't know how many acres. It seems to me it'd be sitting on about 40 acres, 20 to 40 acres, something like that. But the freeway goes around it and continues on down to Lynchburg. That was the old Lynchburg Road. You can see old photos at Appomattox that show the Union Army, the Confederate Army marching out down the long dirt road. That was the Lynchburg Road that went from the center of town straight down to Lynchburg. Now it's the freeway. But while you're there, if you never have a chance to visit, it's an interesting little place. It was quiet the day Rainey and I went there. And there's only a couple of other people there. And standing in a place where history happened is a neat experience. It's a really moving experience. And according to the story, Robert E. Lee, after the signed surrender, the departure, he mounts his horse, walks down the Lynchburg Road with all the Confederate troops following him. War is over. He's surrendered the South. And lining on both sides of the road are the Union soldiers. And the Union soldiers are jeering and booing and hissing at the Confederates and Robert E. Lee as they're passing by. And Ulysses S. Grant stepped out on the porch of that house, that residence at Appomattox, and he silenced by order, by command, silenced his troops. That'll be enough of that kind of thing. And he uttered those famous words, which were consistent with why the North was fighting the Civil War, to preserve the Union. He said, "The rebels are again our countrymen." So my take on the Civil War, I think, gives a very good reasoning behind why some of these statues were erected to Confederate soldiers. The goal of erecting these statues was not to be a symbol of slavery and the South rising again. I think the South erected its statues and were allowed to do so as not a symbol of slavery, but a symbol of unity. We allowed those statues to be erected of Civil War heroes to show that the Confederates, the rebels, are again our countrymen. If the North fought to preserve the Union, then unity was displayed by allowing them to display their officers and the people that they honored in the South, who were also very good men prior to the Civil War, part of this country. So the reunification, the rebels are again our countrymen. I think that was the basis behind statuary being allowed. There was compromise that was included in victory. So now the statue situation, as I went on and we were talking, my friend and I last night, I had said all this, and to black America there's an offense by the statues, and I understand how that could exist. That's a visceral, superficial, I think, response to the statues. To others, there's pride, and I can understand that. So how can you have two conflicting points of view like that and both of them be right? So I think the very best solution, now that it's come again to our doorstep, is to preserve the history while also seeking constructive ways to calm the troubles. Find ways to preserve the symbols of our unity rather than eradicate them from our collective minds and national history. And of course, without getting into it too deeply, much of what you see going on now by the movements that are pushing for eradication, the movements that are now, just this morning I saw an article on pushing to do away with statues of European-looking Jesus and stained windows in churches. Many of them old, priceless antiques need to be smashed out because they show a white-looking Jesus. And when you have that going on all around us, it's imperative to realize that we cannot let movements that have Marxism at their core help create public policy and decisions from mob mentality rather than legislation. And there's no doubt about it. There is Marxism at play here, and one of the things about the earmarks of Marxism is to eradicate a people's history and to eradicate a people's religion. And if they can do that through symbolism and symbology, they do it. That's another show altogether, and we can get into that later at another time. But right now we're out of time for this first segment. I just noticed. I just looked at the clock. Let's be done and come back with this in 2 minutes. Sit tight.
you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, thanks for sitting on through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid Radio program, my program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com for all those of you who'd like to go over and check out the audio version of this show. Also, come on over to my YouTube channel, where we have the simulcast in video and the live chat room with all the Intrepids coming in. They're talking up a storm right now. Come on over to the chat room and watch the video. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. We're talking about compromise. We're talking about statuary. We're talking about racism. We're talking about black views versus white views, conservative versus liberal. All of those kinds of things put into one big pot here, and we're trying to separate, we separate the thinking out, and everybody in anger expresses their views, but who is really looking for compromise? Who is looking for a way to find a solution that works for everybody? Is there a solution to these troubles that works for everyone? I look at what's going on right now and I want to fight it. Not because I am against equal rights or I'm against not offending people and so on and so forth. I think that there is a real issue that exists. There is racism out there. I tend to bristle at the notion of systemic racism. Systemic racism, I think, may exist in pockets. I don't think it exists on a federal level. I don't think it exists as an overall philosophy of operation that's underlying everything that goes on in our nation. I think there are, you look at, again, without opening up a can of worms, I say, I disagree with the notion of white privilege. That simply because my skin is pinkish, I am treated better by my society. Well, who's in charge in my society? White people, black people, Asian people, all kinds of people are in charge. So who's imposing the systemic racism? And not only whites are racist. So I look at these issues and I have to question. This is not me taking a stand against blacks or Black Lives Matter or all that stuff. This is me stating I'm thinking through this issue. So when I look at it, and again, I'm going totally unscripted on this. I write down a lot of notes and read from a lot of notes when I'm doing my radio show, but I'm trying to get a hold of it and hopefully express well to you the feelings that go through my head and have been going through my head. It brings up fight in me. I want to fight it. I want to fight what I believe is at the core of a lot of the troubles we're seeing now, and that's Marxism, communism, if you will. Not communism per se. Nobody's pushing Marxism. Nobody's pushing communism. That's the mode under which all of this is being foisted and operated. And I think most of the people who are doing the protesting and the destruction and things like that are people that don't even know that. They don't even know what's going on. So I look at all of this, and I had this conversation last night with my friend, which I told you about in the last segment. A part of it, anyway. We only got through part of that conversation. And I had said that I believe that the South fought the Civil War to preserve slavery. The North fought it not to end slavery, but to preserve the Union, which they accomplished. And I believe that the statues in the South that are all under question now over the next several decades when they were erected, that those statues were not symbols of slavery or necessarily the Confederacy, but honoring the heroes of the South. And the Union really allowed that to happen, to show that we are willing to compromise. We are willing to show that we want to preserve the Union. And they allowed them to honor their soldiers. And so to black America, that's offensive. To Southerners, it might resemble it might not resemble, it might be a symbol of Southern pride. Not slavery. And so I can understand how those things exist, but how do you make them coexist? The very best solution, now that it's come again and it's rising and all these troubles are here, is to preserve the history while seeking constructive ways to calm the troubles. And finding the ways to preserve the symbols of our unity rather than eradicate them from our collective minds and national history is the key. I believe that if you have statues that are offensive to a group of people, sometimes there's a big so what. Not everything's going to be your cup of tea. Not everything's going to follow your train of thinking. You might have to go along with what the majority is okay with. It's not a fuck you type of a situation. It's a situation of everybody's got to be grown up and recognize that you don't get everything you want. But there are ways to compromise. And when it's all based on feelings, this is how I feel about this and so on, sometimes you've got to set feelings aside and you have to look at the black and white of things. No pun intended with that. And this all spills over into, of course, white supremacy, white privilege. The whites are the only ones that are racist, things like that. And I bristle at all those notions. So my friend said in the conversation last night after we talked about this, and I presented my case, she said, I agree that it's imperative to preserve the history, but it can be done differently than it's being done. And this is going to take time and thoughtfulness and sensitivity. It can't be done in a day. And she added rather jokingly, pancake syrup or no pancake syrup. Talking about, of course, Aunt Jemima. And I responded that I agreed and that I want to see this done without the power struggle over it, but rather a keen mind to preserving peace and finding good middle ground, whose aim is to create unity in compromise and sensitivity to all sides. Now, you can't be everything to everybody. Somebody's going to be butthurt over this from either side. Some people will insist that we don't touch the statues. Other people will insist that we need to tear them down and destroy them, melt them down, and build something new. I say you don't destroy history to preserve history. You preserve your history and you add to it. Yet there's give and take. Unity is composed of compromise. There will need to be compromise on everybody's part to make things work. If we could all agree to say, we need to stop the rioting, we need to stop the extreme voices, everybody shut the fuck up, pardon my French, and everybody come to the table and work just as bristlingly hard to find a peaceful solution. Not one that only demands your point of view. From either side of this issue, folks. The problem is hoping that everybody can handle the give and take that's necessary in a free society. You can't legislate away the statues, nor can you legislate keeping the statues. Well, maybe you can, on a local level. It's not the federal government's job to come in and tell a county or a city what statue they can have. That could be on a state level, it could be more on a city level. So, as we talked about this last night, my friend responded saying, see, you and I always find a way to agree. And we joked around about, we could run on the bipartisan ticket. And so working together rather than against each other is the path to peaceable, common-sensed solutions in a world gone absolutely mad. And we don't have to change our positions on politics and our personal convictions, but we need to seek the ground that creates unity. We're not talking about a heaven and hell issue, and I said to somebody yesterday, I said, this whole issue of the statues starts to look to me like the issue in the church of the elect, if you've ever heard that. The elect are the chosen ones. God chooses people for heaven, and he chooses people for hell. And you are the elect. You are the chosen ones. And those who are not the chosen ones, well, guess what? They get to go to hell. So there was never any hope for them in the first place because they weren't the chosen ones. That, to me, is complete nonsense. And that's part of the reason why I stepped away from the church. I'm not preaching here. I'm just making a comparative. So I left the conversation. By the way, try it. Try compromise. Look at your positions on issues and say, in order to bring peace, and I'm not talking about the peace that's purchased at the price of chains and slavery. I'm talking about finding unity and finding peace and a way to make our country work better. You want to thumb your nose at groups like Black Lives Matter or white supremacists. I believe they're two sides of the same coin, by the way. That's my personal opinion. You want to thumb your nose at both of them? Tell them, all of you shut up. We are going to work to compromise, to preserve unity, not to cater to one mindset. And everybody who is part of a free society needs to do that. You want to know how to become active in your free republic? Find ways that you can be part of creating unity. And so, try it. Maybe give a little. Maybe take a little. Both sides. Now, I left that conversation last night feeling so much lighter and uplifted. It brought tears to my eyes last night. You know me, that's easy for me anyway. But I realized that when we end the fight and seek the better path, we can always find a way that doesn't compromise our desire to do what we know is good and right, but to find a path to unity. And when war breaks out, it's when people cannot find their path to peaceful solutions. There doesn't need to be war. Now, you know me, I'm not a pacifist. I've said many times in the show, sometimes we have to fight to preserve what we believe in. But sometimes you also have to choose the hill you're going to die on. Sometimes you have to determine what is the thing I will fight and what is the thing that I will fight to find unity and compromise. Fight for the compromise. I'm looking at something somebody said on this post I put up this morning. He said, as a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, I can tell you the statues were paid for by daughters, wives, and widows, and the statues are a memorial of the soldiers that were and are buried in unmarked mass graves. Then somebody wants to argue with me about centralized government as opposed to union, blah, 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 blah. Forget that. So these are all things we have to keep in mind as we look at ways to compromise. And I got somebody already criticizing me on that post. I'm sure there will be more of that. I'm used to that by now. So, are you seeking the compromise? Are you seeking the better path? And I wanted to, while talking about this, talk about there's virtue in compromise and there's a damaging decline of compromise. And compromise is a strategic strategy for conflict resolution. And it's essential not only on a national level, but let's morph this down a little bit. Let's talk about personal levels of compromise. Watch my segue here really quick. I'm going to move from a national issue of unity. Let's move to a personal level of unity. Let's talk about our relationships for a moment. Everything starts at home, folks. What is it that drives you to be someone who will not compromise or to be somebody who is willing to compromise, willing to find peaceful solutions? I'm not talking about stupidity that seeks compromise. I'm talking about smart compromise, the way to get there, to find paths to better way. Compromise is a major strategy for conflict resolution. We got conflict in our nation right now. Compromise is going to be the way to find the solution. And it's essential also, bring it home, folks, bring it in. It's essential for your relationship. Got any conflict in your relationship? So whether it's in our personal lives, our workplaces, our communities, or as a citizen of this nation, compromise is important. But it's clearly evident that our capacity to compromise has greatly declined over the last several years. Just look at the fight that's out there. All across the spectrum. Is that because one guy sitting in the office of the president caused everybody to lose their ability to compromise? No. It's that everybody's got to have their point of view and everybody's got to fight to sustain their point of view, and everybody else is an idiot. So I've observed this. I hear people all the time describe these rigidly holding on to of expectations in their most meaningful relationships. And it's similarly evident in the workplace, where a lot of corporations have increasingly focused attention predominantly on shareholders. And they've reduced concern for their workers, their employees, and even the consumer. I slip into that every now and then. I don't like to use the term worker. Worker reminds me of 1984, of Animal Farm, of socialism, communism. You're workers. We're not workers, we're employees. Nobody forces us to work anywhere. We choose, we contract with a company. We're employees. So between corporation and employee, even with consumers, and regardless of the pros and cons, the vast reduction in unions further reflects decreased compromise. Whether you agree with a union or not, what was the purpose of them initially? To find compromise. And now the damage, and to protect the employees. And so now, the damaging decline of compromise is certainly revealed in the paralysis of our government due to the intensity of partisanship. And it's further revealed in the barking, raised voices of talking heads on the news who talk all over each other and argue and fight, each one trying their best to state their point with little attention to that of the other's point. And they offer sound bites that are intended to convince the audience of their opinion and show little attempt to hear each other out genuinely. And even the best newscasts often support this verbal combat in an effort to gain ratings rather than accord. Gotta have ratings. Gotta do this. So, there are contributing factors, I think, to the decline in compromise out there. Numerous factors have fueled this far-reaching decline of compromise in recent years. Some studies have suggested a general increase in narcissism over the past 2 decades. Self-absorption that leaves us with diminished empathy and concern for other people. We have to have our way. It's all about me. It's all about what I think. It's all about what my group thinks, what my movement thinks. It's not about anybody else. It's time for us to take back what is rightfully ours. It's time for recompense. It's time for reparation. All of these types of things get talked about. And that's the narcissism that has led us to where we are today. Some cite the decrease in actual face-to-face personal interactions. Conversation with my friend last night was not face-to-face, but it was a personal one rather than a social media one. Whether it's family, it's friends, it's neighbors. You know, the internet and social media have offered us great ways to stay in touch with our loved ones when we're not close by. When it's a 3.5-hour drive to see a relative, somebody you grew up with, a brother or sister. Sometimes social media is a great transplant for that. During the whole pandemic, I got together with friends in groups of people on Zoom, different varied forms of video conferencing, where we all got together and talked. It's social media, but it was one way that we could do it. And so we bury our faces in screens rather than talk to our family, our friends, or neighbors, or the large groups that we belong to. This burying of ourselves in social media are ways that make us less attuned to the nuances of differences and uniqueness among people in our lives. As a result, we define them in our minds with broad labels rather than take the time to really be present with their true complexity. Do we hear them out? Do we know what they believe? Do they know what's in their heart? Harshly negative comments to articles and videos on the internet further reflect this rigidity of thought that we've entered into, as well as the demonization that only further undermines compromise in our relationships. Gotta demonize everybody. I just watched the demonization of the current president. Every single word out of his mouth gets demonized by one set of thinking and replicated and perpetuated in social media while the other group fights it. So our culture's glorified, and by the way, that only undermines compromise in our relationship. When we do it outwardly, it affects us inwardly as well. Our culture has glorified individualism from the time of our nation's revolution. We're individuals. We stand for what we believe in. And we take this attitude to new heights as we glorify the importance of individual growth and individual happiness. You gotta be happy to have a good relationship. And it then makes sense that many of us feel less inclined to be sensitive to the needs of others. What's the big thing we've learned over the last 20 to 30 years? Oh, if you're not happy in your relationship, leave it. If you're not happy as a mother, go find your happiness. If you're not happy as a father, go find your happiness. Because how can you possibly be a good parent if you're not happy with yourself? What a selfishly based paradigm we've entered. Oh, I'm not happy giving myself to my family. You know what? I'd be really happy if I could travel. If I could get back into globetrotting, go back to Egypt, go to other places I want to see. But you know what? I can't do that. I got a family. And we can't afford to take everybody along. Sometimes I'm allowed. My wife says, go do that thing. Other times it's like, we can't afford to do that as a family. Is there sacrifice? Are there things that we don't like that support our being part of our family? Yeah. Would I be happy doing those other things? Yeah. But I would be less happy if I sacrificed my family for it. Same thing with affairs. I got to bring this in. When we have affairs of the heart, who are we hurting? Our families. We're elevating our own happiness above our families, above our wives, our husbands, our kids. That's another thing altogether, another topic altogether, but you get what I'm saying. We're drawing very close to the close of this show. We're running out of time here, folks, and I've got tons of information in front of me, so we might pick up this idea tomorrow, but the more intensely competitive that we become in our points of view, the more task-focused and the less people-oriented we become a people that overtly values competition and has undermined our openness for compromise. Do you have the ability to compromise? Do you have the ability to say, I hold very strong personal views, common-sensed views, but are you so rigid in that you cannot find a path to compromise for people who don't think the same way you do? I might think, and there might be some of you right now that are saying, I know what I believe. I'm never going to compromise my stand on this issue. Because I think my way through it, and I have common sense. But when we do that, what do we sacrifice? We sacrifice the ability to be flexible. What you need to do is search for the path to flexibility, to compromise, to find ways to maintain your morals, your judgments, your convictions on things while still finding a path to peace for people who don't think the same way you think, as wrong as they might be. So there it is, folks. That's all I got for tonight. That's all we got time for tonight. Find the path to peaceful solutions and tell everybody else out there that's trying to stir you up from whatever movement is out there going on, tell them to go, I want to just say, go F themselves. And you promote the better path and tell them to take a hike. I think that's the best approach we can have. There's no compromise when somebody's trying to destroy who you are. But there's compromise when you're all trying to find a peaceful solution. That's it. We got to go. Folks, thanks for being here. 23-hour break, and we'll be back. Sit tight.